Mr. President, what are we doing here? Seriously, I'm still waiting for somebody to tell me how this makes sense. We are debating a budget that gives another round of tax cuts to billionaires and giant corporations on the backs of everyday Americans. And it also adds trillions of dollars to our national debt. That doesn't make any sense to me. And it doesn't make sense to the Arizonans that I've been hearing from in every corner of our state. If you grew up in a household like mine, where money was tight, you would know that budgets are about priorities. I can still picture my mom sitting at the kitchen table trying to figure out which bills to pay. You take the money you have and you put it where it's needed. This budget clearly tells the American people who President Trump and Republicans in Washington need help. If you're a billionaire, it says, we've got your back. But if you're a parent trying to provide for your family, a senior in a nursing home, or a child who counts on school for your only hot meal, you're on your own. This isn't about balancing the books. It's about picking winners and letting everybody else fall behind. And who loses? It's the Americans working 2 jobs, raising kids, caring for elderly parents, and just trying to stay afloat. Because if you grew up in a family like mine, you also know how hard people work to reach their American dream. The promise that if you work hard, that your kids will get a good public education, you'll be able to put food on the table, and you'll be able to go to the doctor and stay healthy, and your kids will be able to grow up and achieve their own American dream. This promise is already getting harder, and it's getting more expensive. We need to be working together across the aisle to ensure that everyone who works hard can have a brighter future. But that's not what my Republican colleagues are doing with this bill. The plan that they are jamming through right now will put the American dream out of reach for more families. And for what? To hand out more tax breaks to people with more wealth than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. Now, Mr. President, I've spent the last several months traveling across Arizona. I've been to our big cities, Phoenix and Tucson. I've been to small towns like Clarkdale and Sierra Vista, talking to Arizonans face to face, listening to their stories, hearing what it would mean to them if Medicaid, food assistance, and other essential services got cut for them and their families. And what I've heard is clear. This budget is going to make it harder for them to stay afloat, let alone get ahead. In Clarksdale, I met a guy named Christian. He's a rural hospital nephrologist. That's a kidney doctor. And he told me that his patients, many of whom rely on Medicaid for dialysis, are now considering stopping treatment altogether because they might not be able to afford it. He said, this is a quote from Christian, he said, financially, none of the patients I serve can pay out of pocket. It's a choice of either massive debt or death. That's the reality to many rural communities. Another woman told me about her friend, a survivor of 2 car accidents and a spinal injury. Her friend relies on Medicaid to help her deal with her chronic pain. Without it, meaning Medicaid, she said that her friend might end her life because the pain is unbearable. She asked me to deliver this message to my colleagues. She said, "This is not a country that can't afford to care for people like her. We can afford to care for everyone if we change our priorities from giving tax cuts to billionaires to taking care of Americans who are in pain every day." Mr. President, people across Arizona are pleading with us to get our priorities right. In Sierra Vista, I hosted a Medicaid town hall, and that's where I met this woman named Tara. She told us how she was once a single mother and how programs like Medicaid and SNAP helped her raise her kid and build a stable life. Today, she works a good job. She doesn't rely on these programs anymore. But here's what she said. She said, "I am deeply concerned about the proposed cuts to Medicaid, SNAP, and related programs. I know firsthand that they don't just help families, they're often the only path to stability." Just last week, I was in Tucson, where Gabby and I live, helping distribute school lunches at a local high school. It's actually the high school that my wife went to. And I wanted to see firsthand what these summer meal programs mean for Arizona families. These programs are funded through the United States Department of Agriculture, and they rely on data from SNAP and Medicaid to identify the children who need them the most. If this bill passes, a bunch of these kids that I served, I think it was last weekend, they won't be eligible for these programs anymore. It will be harder for them to access school meals, which I think we all know it compromises their academic performance. That's the real cost of this legislation. It's not numbers on a spreadsheet. It's hunger. It's illness. It's fear. It's a bunch of folks who work really hard, doing everything right, and they're still going to get punched in the gut. And it's not just what I hear in person, Mr. President. My office gets hundreds of letters and phone calls every week from Arizonans. People are scared, and they want us to listen. I want to share some of their voices. Frank is a veteran on dialysis. He called this week, and he said, "The food bank and my SNAP benefits are the only way I eat right now. I can't work. I'm not old enough to retire, and I'm dipping into my retirement early just to keep up with my mortgage. Without this help, I don't know what I will do." Mr. President, veterans should never have to say those words in this country. One of the most sacred promises we make to the men and women who serve is that we will take care of them when they return home. That promise doesn't end when they hang up the uniform. It includes making sure that they can afford food, access health care, and live with some dignity. And yet, here's Frank, sick, struggling, and wondering how he'll survive because the programs he relies on are under threat. Cheryl from Tucson, who is a 59-year-old widow, said, "I receive disabled widows' benefits, Medicaid, Medicare, and SNAP. Get this. She said, my rent and utilities eat all but about $300 of my monthly income. SNAP and my health care card used to cover most of my food costs. I used to have about $40 left over to buy some extra groceries for the unsheltered in my area. So here's a woman with $40 extra, and she's helping other people. She also says now, buying food for my household takes all of it. I'm scared. If I lose even one of these benefits, I'll lose the grip that keeps the roof over my head. Karen from Scottsdale has worked for over 25 years helping veterans and people with disabilities. She wrote, many of the people I work with rely on Medicaid because they can only work part-time or because their employers don't offer benefits. Cutting them off will just make health care more expensive for everyone. The rich do not need an extension on tax cuts at the expense of low-income and middle-class families. Mr. President, these are my constituents. These are folks who, unprompted, took time to write or call their senator. And every single one of them, Mr. President, is saying the same thing. We're barely holding on, and we're scared this is going to put us over the edge. Now, I wish I could say that these stories were met with compassion by everybody here. But instead, one of my Republican colleagues apparently said, this is a quote, they'll get over it. And another, when asked whether cutting Medicaid would cost lives, said, well, we're all going to die anyway. Now, I didn't come here to throw jabs. I'm repeating those words because they reveal how this budget was written without any connection to the real-world consequences. This isn't about politics. It's about people. So I ask again, what are we doing here? Who do we serve? Is it people like Tara and Cheryl and Crystal and Frank who are working hard and doing everything right to just try to get by? Or is it a bunch of billionaires who've already made it and who don't need another handout? If my colleagues don't believe me, I urge them to go read some of the emails and listen to some of the phone calls that they're getting. Maybe hold a town hall. Listen to those folks. Really, listen to what they are saying. Don't crush their American dream. Don't rig the system even more against them. Don't take a vote just because it's easy. We can do better for the people we serve. Mr. President, they deserve that from us. Thank you, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from Wisconsin.
I rise today in disbelief. You know, it may sound a little cheesy, but at the end of the day, I fundamentally believe in public service. I believe it can be a force for good, a force that gives people opportunity, a force that is people-powered, that can lift our neighbors up and instill hope, a force that meets the toughest challenges of our constituents, and that is why I am struck with disbelief. Disbelief because If you believe these things like I do, which I would argue most of my colleagues here do, why would you be jamming this bill through? At a time when Wisconsin families are asking us to take on the high cost of living and let them have a fair shot at success, Republicans are raising costs and making an already unfair tax system even worse. My Republican colleagues are not using their time and energy to go after greedy corporations, not to lower the cost of housing, and not to expand access to affordable health care, but rather they are instead forging ahead with a bill that will kick millions of Americans off their health insurance, jack up prices for care for millions more, and literally take food off the tables of hungry families. Look, I was on the same ballot as Donald Trump last year. I heard the same concerns from my constituents that he did. Families needed some breathing room. My Republican colleagues often say that this president's victory gave him a mandate. Well, then, the president and I got the same mandate: to lower costs and give people the opportunity to live a steady and comfortable life. But in response, the difference could not be more stark. I'm actually working to do something about it. And this bill, the landmark bill from this president and the Republican Party, does just the opposite and will raise costs for families. One of the biggest cost drivers I hear about is health care. And so instead of standing up to big drug companies to lower prescription drug costs, and instead of building on the Affordable Care Act to expand access to health care coverage, this bill actually terminates coverage for Americans. In fact, 17 million Americans will be kicked off either Medicaid or the Affordable Care Act because of this bill. That is like stripping health care coverage from the entire populations of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa combined. And these aren't just numbers. These are people. These are people who have stories, and they matter. I should know, after battling a childhood illness, I became one of those Americans labeled as having a pre-existing health condition. And insurance companies were legally able to deny me coverage. But because of the Affordable Care Act, we changed that. And we gave families like mine hope. Hope that they can get health care at a price they can afford and sleep well at night knowing they have coverage. Medicaid has given that same hope for generations to some of our most vulnerable neighbors. But with this bill, my Republican colleagues are instilling fear. When we talk about Medicaid, we're talking about the elderly, people with disabilities, and children. We're talking about a single mother of 3 who is struggling to make ends meet, and so many more. I have traveled the state of Wisconsin from Superior to Racine, La Crosse to Green Bay, and everywhere in between, to hear from people who will be harmed by this bill. I have come to this very floor to share their stories, to try to help my Republican colleagues understand what this bill will mean. But it's not just the folks who need Medicaid to survive who are sounding the alarm. Take it from Dr. Abigail Wilgruber, a family medical resident in rural Wisconsin. She said this bill, quote, will deprive millions of Americans, particularly children, seniors, and individuals with disabilities, of the care they need to survive. She continued saying, these provisions will limit my ability to complete my job to the fullest, will lead to worse outcomes for patients. Or take it from Rosalanja Burbot, the executive director of an outpatient counseling center in the Fox Valley in Wisconsin, who said, and I quote, "Without Medicaid and Medicare reimbursements or with reduced rates, our nonprofit will struggle to survive." She continued to say, quote, "I would hate to consider cutting staff or programs, but that could become our only option. We would lose the ability to serve hundreds of clients, not because the need has diminished, but because we could no longer afford to provide care without reimbursement." I have more and more of these stories from doctors, nurses, and administrators on the ground who are spelling out the absolutely dire consequences of this bill. In Wisconsin, we are already in a crisis when it comes to getting good health care in our rural communities. The system is broken, and this bill is destined to make it only worse. While health care is near and dear to my heart, there is more bad news in this bill. Republicans' big betrayal will also take food assistance, the literal means by which some people are able to put nutritious food on the table, away from them. This bill will take SNAP assistance, our nation's best way to make sure that no one goes hungry, away from more than 3 million Americans. And that leads us to the why. Republicans are making all of these cuts so that they can rig our tax code, which I must say already is deeply unfair to working families. And they would further tilt it in favor of the biggest corporations and the richest in our country. The Republican bill gives people at the top 0.1%, the richest of the rich, a tax cut of more than $250,000 every year. Yes, $250,000 a year. All the while, this bill hits working families the hardest. When taking into account the disastrous Medicaid and SNAP cuts, many working families would see their annual incomes fall by over $1,500. And it doesn't have to be this way. Yes, our system for taxes and health care are broken, but this bill is not the solution. This bill would make it harder for working families to have the opportunity to get ahead, harder for parents to get their kids health care, harder for families to put food on the table. We, Democrats and Republicans, should be working together to give some relief to workers, but instead, Republicans will choose to go it alone and vote to give the biggest corporations and the wealthy another unfair leg up. I will end with this. While I remain in disbelief and frankly disgust, I will always have hope. I have hope because it's not the people in this chamber with the power, it's the people. It's the people who will sadly feel the repercussions of this bill. It's the people who are rising up and will hold anyone who passes this disastrous bill accountable. That is where the true power is. And with that, I yield.
Madam President.
The senator from Hawaii.
Madam President, Democrats have been on the floor for hours today, pointing out what's in this 1,000-page bill that took over 16 hours to read. I call it the 1,000 pages of pain, the billionaires' gain. So it's bad enough that my colleagues have been on the floor talking about how this bill is going to hurt people on Medicaid, taking food away from our children and families through major cuts to the SNAP program, healthcare, food, housing, energy support, you name it. The pain is in this bill. But one of the areas that people don't know about is this bill actually has provisions that would take away support for our public schools. Okay, let that sink in. It's not enough that this bill has 1,000 pages of pain in just about every aspect of our lives that you can think of, but now they're coming after support for our public schools. So today, I am rising as an advocate for the 49 million children who are enrolled in public schools across our country. Nearly 90% of K-12 students go to public schools, including 95% of children with disabilities. Yet, we have a regime that is actively working to end federal support for public schools. We have a president who tried to totally eliminate the Department of Education, and sadly for him, he can't do it with through executive order because only Congress can do that, but they're doing a lot of other things that withhold support for public schools. So as Republicans in Congress are trying to undermine support for public schools through the first ever national private school voucher program. Let that sink in. The first ever national private school voucher program. That is taking money away from public schools and basically turning it over to private schools through a voucher program. So let's be clear. The school voucher program, the provision, isn't about money for schools. It's about even more money for billionaires because they're the folks who are going to get the most out of this voucher for public schools program. Under this program, wealthy donors would receive large handouts for supporting school vouchers. So this is why Washington The Washington Post in their headline, GOP voucher plan would divert billions, $4 billion a year in taxes in perpetuity to private schools. So specifically, the plan would provide a dollar-for-dollar tax credit. We're not talking about tax deductions. We're talking about a tax credit. This is money that comes right off your taxable amount. So what this bill would do is provide a tax credit of $5,000 or 10% of a taxpayer's adjusted gross income, whichever is greater. So a taxpayer making $10 million, we do have people who make $10 million a year, could contribute $1 million and receive a credit for that full amount. How do you like that? You can get $1 million off your tax bill by contributing to this private school voucher program. So rather than calling this plan what it is, and I tell you, the word scam comes to my mind. It's like scamming the public schools. Republicans are deceitfully trying to sell this plan as an expansion of school choice for families. Oh, isn't this voucher program great? More families can send their kids to private school. Here's the reality. Based on what we know about school voucher programs, they do not promote school choice. Let me give you two examples of why this argument does not hold water. For one thing, school vouchers do not cover the full cost of private school tuition. When was the last time anybody thought about how much private schools cost? Maybe, in schools in Hawaii, private schools can cost something in the order of $15,000 to $20,000 a year, starting from kindergarten. A voucher program will not support that full amount. That means that families who want to send their kids to these private schools will have to make up the cost difference. Well, how many middle-income, low-income families would be able to exercise that choice to send their child to a private school that costs that much? And not only that, as we have seen in states that have passed voucher programs, private schools often raise their tuition when they become eligible for vouchers. Iowa is an example. After they approved vouchers in 2022, private schools there increased their prices by over 20% for kindergarten and by over 10% for other grade levels. Here's another example of why this argument that this program promotes choice. There are fewer private schools in rural communities, so many families do not have access to private schools if they live in rural communities. How does this expand choice for these families? The reality is the majority of vouchers have gone to wealthy families and to subsidizing school tuition for students who already attend private schools. Under this bill, Republicans will make that even worse by prioritizing scholarships for these students. I'm going to repeat that because not only is it bad enough that we're going to divert all of this money basically to private schools, but this bill actually has a provision that says the people who will get these scholarships are students who already go to private schools. In Louisiana, for example, now 99% of voucher tax credits there went to families with annual incomes above $200,000. In Virginia, the number was 87% of vouchers in that state going to wealthy families. In Arizona, it was 60%. Americans have consistently rejected school voucher programs and initiatives. Nebraska, Kentucky, and Colorado have all voted against voucher programs within the last year. In Nebraska, school vouchers were put on the ballot last November, and they were soundly defeated for the fourth time. This is not a Democratic or a Republican issue. Nebraska is not a red state. They voted for a Republican president by a 20-point margin, and yet they rejected school vouchers with 57% of the vote. The bottom line is, vouchers take money away from public schools, and Americans of all political stripes understand that. According to All for Ed, over 2/3 of voters would rather increase funding for public schools than increase funding for voucher programs. That is not a new sentiment. In all 17 state referendums on school vouchers since 1967, voters have rejected these programs. While the Republicans in this chamber may not give a rip about public schools, the vast majority of Americans get it. Democrats, Republicans, independents alike support strengthening our public schools, not taking money away from our public schools, because they know that strong public education is fundamental to a strong country. Well, undeterred by public sentiment, Republicans are trying to create, as I mentioned, a nationwide school voucher program. It's not enough that some states have voucher programs, but now the Republicans, through this misguided almost 1,000 pages of Payne bill, they want to provide $4 billion per year for a private school voucher program with no accountability. Remember early on I said that a huge percentage of children with disabilities go to public schools? Well, private schools do not have any responsibility to make sure that they are providing education for children with disabilities. So no accountability. Let's just provide $4 billion per year, perpetuity, tax credit for private school programs that have no accountability along these lines. We all know that this kind of funding could be used for rural and low-income schools, for students with disabilities, for other programs that actually support and strengthen public schools. Instead, under The Republicans' plan, that funding will go to wealthy donors who will receive large handouts, up to $4 billion a year, for supporting school vouchers. Again, this plan will enable a taxpayer making $10 million a year to contribute $1 million and receive a dollar-for-dollar credit for that full amount. And even worse, the taxpayer could contribute appreciated stock and avoid capital gains on the appreciation. And there's all kinds of data on who owns stocks in this country, and generally it's the people with a lot of wealth. So this bill had a provision that enabled people to donate appreciated stock so that they could escape capital gains taxes on that stock contribution totally. So this Republican voucher proposal, outlandish as it is, was briefly delayed after it was deemed non-compliant with budget rules earlier this week. Republicans remained undeterred, and they have decided to plow forward with a nearly identical plan. What it comes down to is this plan does not help students. It does not promote choice. It does not support public schools where the majority of our kids go. We should be supporting our public schools, not taking resources away from them. So my Democratic colleagues and I will continue to fight to fund quality public schools to improve public education in this country. Foundational. This voucher plan is yet another wrong-headed proposal that should be called out for what it is, a handout for the wealthy at the expense of hardworking American families. I urge my colleagues to reject this idea, and I yield back.
Madam President.
The senator from Georgia.
Madam President, I rise tonight in a moral moment in our nation. As we debate this bill, so much is on the line. The health care of over 16 million Americans, 750,000 of them Georgians, is on the line. Food for hungry children. In a wealthy nation where 1 in 5 children are already food insecure. They don't know where their next meal is coming from. Their livelihood, their welfare is on the line. The well-being of seniors in nursing homes and the disabled who rely on Medicaid and those who care for them is on the line. The fate of rural hospitals in Georgia, in Alaska, in Louisiana, in little towns all over this nation that are right now barely hanging on is on the line, and the scraps that they are throwing them while cutting them will not save them. And my friends on the other side of the aisle know it. They know that these scraps that they're throwing at rural hospitals will not save them. And so in a very real sense, lives are on the line. We are in a moral moment because something else is on the line. I submit that the character of the country is on the line. In a real sense, the question tonight is, who are we? Not who do we tell ourselves we are, but who are we really? What and who do we care about? What kind of nation are we? And what kind of people do we want to be? Who matters? And who doesn't? Who do we think is dispensable? In no place is the answer to that question clearer than in a nation's budget. I submit that a budget is not just a fiscal document. A budget is a moral document. Show me your budget and I'll show you who you think matters and who doesn't. And if this awful budget were an EKG, it would suggest that our nation has a heart problem and is in need of moral surgery. And so I'm clear tonight. I understand the nature of what we are engaged in. This is a political process. It is. But it is also a moral exercise. Not only for the nation, but for each of us individually. And especially for the mere 100 of us out of a nation of 300 million who get to vote, perhaps in a matter of hours. We have the rare privilege of standing up for people who have entrusted with us the covenant of centering their families. It's a real privilege for the people of your state to say that since we can't all go to Washington, we're going to trust you in rooms of power to be thinking about our children, to be thinking about our parents as they deal with the blessings and the burdens of growing old. And so the question for me tonight is, how will we show up in this moment? And that's why yesterday I gathered in the Russell Rotunda with a multi-faith coalition of clergy to pray that lawmakers might have the courage to stand up to their party, to stand up to the special interests, and protect seniors in nursing homes and pregnant mothers on Medicaid and children who risk going to school hungry every single day in this country. 1 in 5 children in the wealthiest nation on the planet already food insecure. And with these SNAP cuts, this body is about to make it worse. And so, surrounded by a clergy of many faith traditions, yesterday I prayed that we would have the courage. I prayed that we would have the grace to stand as voices for the voiceless. And as I stood there, I could not help but feel a sense of deja vu. This is not the first time I've been in our nation's capital speaking out against these policies that betray hardworking families. It was 8 years ago, almost to the day in 2017, when Washington Republicans were trying to pass a tax bill that favored wealthy Americans over working families, that I came to this building not as a senator, but as a pastor. I had no idea that 8 years later I would be serving in this body. I had no notion that I would even run for the Senate. I came as a citizen. And standing with a multi-faith coalition, we were praying for our nation's leaders. We were gathered in the rotunda of the Russell building, and as we were singing and praying, the Capitol Police said, I'm sorry, pastors, you can't sing and pray in the rotunda. If you do not disperse, we will have to arrest you. And let me say that the Capitol Police did not mishandle us that day. They were first-rate professionals. But they said that if You don't disperse, we will have to arrest you. What they didn't understand is that I had already been arrested. My conscience had been arrested. My heart and my imagination, my moral imagination, had been arrested by this idea that we as a country are better than this. I come from a tradition where you don't just pray with your lips, you pray with your legs. You put your body in the struggle for other struggling bodies. And so here I am tonight, 8 years later, having transformed my agitation into legislation. I was arrested that day, but I have transformed my protests into public policy. 8 years ago, I was on the outside. Tonight, I'm on the inside, but it's the same fight. Some of us fight on the inside, some of us fight on the outside, some of us get to serve in the Senate or in the House, others are just watching at home tonight, but be really clear that we are in the same fight, whether we are on the streets or in the suites. Same fight. And in some ways, this is the same bill 8 years later, just worse. Like most horror movies, the sequel tends to be worse. We were here 8 years ago. Washington politicians were trying their best to gut the Affordable Care Act. Remember that? They were trying to gut the Obamacare out of political motives. Millions of Americans were spared. But tonight is the sequel to that horror movie. They are back to their old political tricks, trying to dismantle the ACA again with this legislation. It's the same fight, just worse this time. Instead of extending tax credits that would lower health insurance costs for the middle class, my friends on the other side are giving billionaires and the richest of the rich a tax cut. They are working real hard tonight to help billionaires because God knows they are having a hard time, apparently. What that means is that 1.2 million Georgians and nearly 20 million Americans are going to see their health care premiums rise. That's what's at stake tonight. If they enact these deep cuts to Medicaid, as they are positioned not to extend these premiums, these tax credits, they are raising the cost of health care for all of us. Even if you are on private insurance, you are not safe. Your health care is about to go up. Your hospital might close because they're cutting these clean energy tax cuts. Your utility bills are about to go up. And so I have a question tonight. Who voted for that? Some of us are Democrats, some of us are Republicans, some of us are independents, some voted for one party, some voted for the other party. I get it, but who voted for that? Who voted for everybody's health care premiums to go up and their hospitals to close? Here's what I know. The folks back in Georgia didn't vote for that. They voted for me and they voted for Donald Trump, but they didn't vote for that. Ordinary folks don't want this. Just ordinary, everyday people who barely pay attention to politics, they don't want this. Even a Fox News poll, and you won't often hear me say that, but even a Fox News poll from this month found that Americans don't support this big, ugly bill. This is symptomatic of the ways in which the people's voices have been squeezed out of their democracy. This is not just a health care fight, it is that. It is not just a fight for food security, for SNAP, it is that. But in a real sense, it is a fight for our democracy, whose voice gets to be heard in this chamber. That's what this is about, the character of the country. Ordinary Americans don't want to do this to our children. That's why they need to know that 71% of all Medicaid enrollees in Georgia are children. 71%. Taking away health care from kids to pay for tax cuts for billionaires. Now, let me be clear. I'm all for tax cuts. I believe working families deserve a tax cut, and I certainly don't want to see them face a tax hike this year. That's why I want to nearly double the child tax credit. I believe in tax cuts for hardworking families, for middle-class people, for working-class families. But instead of doing that, instead of helping working-class families who are struggling now against a 10% tax on everything and rising costs, we're now burdening our children by adding $3 trillion to the debt. We're taking away health care from kids and then burdening them with the debt. We are engaged in Robin Hood in reverse, this body of stealing from the poor in order to give to the rich. This massive transfer of wealth from the bottom to the top. Yeah, this is socialism for the rich. And when the people hear about it, guess what? They don't like it. Democrats and Republicans and independents, when the people hear about what's in this big, ugly bill, they don't like it. And that's why the folks on the other side are trying their best to fast track it. That's why they're trying to pass it, and they haven't even finished writing it. They're twisting themselves in knots, making their members walk the plank under the threat of a primary to pass this big, ugly bill. The American people do not want to rob our children of food and health care and then burden them with trillions in debt to give billionaires and wealthy corporations another tax cut. The people do not want this bill. And so if the people do not want this bill, but they are trying to pass it, here's the question you got to ask yourselves at home. You have to ask yourselves, well, who are they working for? Who are they fighting for? Who do they think matters? Do you think they are working for you? This is a moral moment, and a budget is a moral document. And we have been summoned to this moment, people of faith and people of moral courage who claim no particular faith at all. And maybe because I was here yesterday and 8 years ago for a similar fight with faith leaders, maybe because I'm a preacher and it's Sunday, and I've been here instead of church, I have especially been thinking about those of us who are people of faith. People whose lives are informed by Scripture, people of the book. And maybe those of us who have different politics but read from the same book ought to spend some time together reading the book. Because I do sometimes wonder, and I say this with all humility, none of us owns the truth. But if I'm honest, there are days when I have to ask people of my faith tradition as a Christian, are we reading the same book? The book I know says, I was hungry and you fed me. I was sick, I was in prison and you visited me. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it also unto me. The book that I love says, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. Speak out for those who cannot speak, for the rights of the destitute. Speak out, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy. My book says, whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord and will be repaid in full. The prophet Amos condemns those who buy the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They sell the poor out and working class people for cheap. And for those of us who have a vote in this moment, for my colleagues who are swinging on a moral dilemma, I hear the prophet Micah say, he has already told you what is good. And what does the Lord require? But that you do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. May God be with our nation and grant us grace, wisdom, and courage for this moment. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from New Hampshire.
Madam President, first I want to thank my colleagues, and especially just now my colleague from Georgia, for their work tonight, for their expression of what's at stake in this moment, and to Senator Warnock, I say thank you and amen. I'm here today because I'm joining the majority of Americans who are deeply alarmed by this plan from the president and his congressional allies, a plan